Welcome to America's Fractured Politics. Today I've got a special guest. I've got Lorissa Rinehart, and we are going to talk about a few things, but principally about Jeanette Rankin, the first woman ever elected to Congress. Larissa's done a book about that, and I'll have her talk about that in a minute. But it's a fascinating subject, and I think one that everybody will find really interesting and frankly inspiring. So let's start with your book. Give us the title, publication date, everything else.
Well, thank you so much for having me on, Mark. I am really excited to be here to talk about Jeanette Rankin and whatever else we discuss. So, yes, my book is entitled Winning the Earthquake: How Jeanette Rankin Defied All the Odds to Become America's First Congresswoman. And as the title implies, she was America's first Congresswoman elected in 1916. For those of you keeping score at home, that is 4 years before the 19th Amendment was ratified. But she was able to do so by first getting women's suffrage passed through her home state of Montana and then converting that political machine to her own historic congressional run. In addition to being America's first Congresswoman, she was also a lifelong advocate for peace and expanded democratic rights, which, of course, are so relevant to our own moment today.
And she was a Republican back when Republicans were very different than what Republicans are today.
Yes, that's right. She really was on the Republican Party that Teddy Roosevelt built and that, Abraham Lincoln built. Now, I will say she did not necessarily identify in one political party. She always identified as a patriot, but the Republican Party at the time was sort of most in line with her progressive policies. So yes, she did run on the Republican ticket in 1916 and won.
Um, so we're going to get to this in a bit, but talk about her place in history a little bit. Kind of place her in
So her
history.
place, yeah, so her place in history, she was born in 1890. No, I'm sorry, 1880. So that's before Montana was even a state. She was the oldest of seven siblings, six of whom survived. And she really spent a lot of her early years being, that second mother, like a lot of women were at that time, especially in Montana, right? A very rural place where it took everyone just to survive. So she didn't start her career in politics until she was in her late 20s. And she did start, like a lot of women, with the suffrage campaign. And she eventually rose to becoming the National Field Secretary of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, which was really like the campaign manager. So she traveled all around the country advocating for suffrage until she decided to focus on her own state of Montana. And also she diverged from Nassau, Nassau, I don't know how you say it, but in a little bit because she had a really clear sense of grassroots campaigning and organizing where they were a bit more from an East Coast sensibility of top down. So she left to organize Montana, successfully, passed the women's right to vote there. And then, as I mentioned, ran for Congress in 1916. Then in Congress, her sort of initial claim to fame was her first vote in Congress was against World War I. She was one of 50 to vote against the war in Congress. And I think there are only 6 in the Senate who did the same. But nevertheless, there at least was a group of people who didn't think that America should join World War I in Congress. Between the interwars, and we can get between the wars, and we can get into this more, but she spent almost that entire time campaigning for disarmament. And, the world in 1919, I think, is really difficult for us to understand today because global armament was not necessarily a given. In fact, it didn't exist. ICBMs didn't exist, battleships didn't exist, the radio was in its infancy. The world had an opportunity to build peace rather than build the machines of war. And that was really what she spent her time doing, was lobbying and organizing against governments being able to build these machines of war. Because as she famously said, prepare for peace and you will get peace, prepare for war and you will get war. And so what happened was, she saw the opposite happening, that the world was arming, that treaties were being ignored and broken. And she ran for Congress again in 1939 with the express purpose of trying to put her hand on that, on the levers of power to halt this global armament movement, which of course she was unable to do. And the result was World War II. And we can, I'll answer your questions with, I'm sure you have a few regarding her, stance on the Second World War.
Right, I do. First of all, before we get into that, what made you decide to write about her?
First of all, I'm a women's historian. That's what I do. And I am particularly drawn to American women's stories and women who were actually quite involved with democracy and building democracy. And that's what interested me first in Jeanette, was her really strong commitment to expanding the electorate, to democratic reforms, and to expanding the definition of we the people. And I think that's we're at a time where that sensibility is more needed than ever. And I was also fascinated, why is America's first Congresswoman completely absent from our histories, right? Whenever something is not there is very interesting to me. And I wanted to explore that more. And what I found was, for reasons that were structural and intentional, she was really erased by the historical narrative that we understand today, not only in, primary and secondary education, but also in the popular history books that you and I read. Her perspective and her voice are really left out from because it doesn't necessarily jive with what I would say, accepted narrative of that period, really from, 1910 through 1945, which really set the stage for the world in which we live now was set.
I've known some biographers, and I think the one common point that I've found among them is that they really become immersed with their subject. You start to identify with them in a really personal and intimate way. Did that happen with you?
It really did. That's a great question. I think one of the most difficult things about writing this book for me was going back to Jeanette's stance on World War II. She voted against World War II. She was the single dissenting vote.
Very gutsy.
Very gutsy. And I'm happy to talk more about that. But just from my own... Great. And from my own personal perspective, I grew up wanting to be Lauren Bacall, fighting Nazis in a jazz club in a well-tailored suit. That was my dream. And I married a jazz musician, and I fight Nazis as best I can through my own medium. I can't sing like she could, but I do what I can. And in addition to that, my first son's middle name is Roosevelt. So I really identify with this period of history as one of the formative periods of not only America, but what America stands for. And it was very difficult for me to write about someone who voted against what I viewed as a cut and dry moral imperative. But the more I researched her, the more I read about her disarmament work between wars and her peace advocacy, even before World War I, the more I began to understand a different perspective. Not necessarily that was possible in 1939 or 1941, but that existed before that that the world could have taken a different road. And that road was made clear by people like Jeanette Rankin and others. So in that work, I did start to identify with her. And then in addition, I think this book is incredibly prescient in our own moment. Speaking of peace, but then Jeanette was also, really an adversary of oligarchs. Her own state of Montana was controlled almost entirely by Anaconda Copper at the time, an unofficial subsidiary of Standard Oil. It owned not only most of Montana's mining interests, which were vast, but also its newspapers, its power grid, and and in addition, its state legislature. So she really flew in the face of this oligarchic power in her state by standing up for workers' rights, women's rights, and also Native people's rights. So, and for democratic rights in general, right, which oligarchs don't generally like.
No, they don't.
So, yeah, they don't. So I really did identify a great deal with her and her story, and its relevance to exactly what we are confronting today.
It's interesting because she did a lot of things that women today are trying to do, but she did it in an era where it wasn't terribly popular and it wasn't very much looked upon as an avocation for women. How did she sort of surmount the stereotypes that surround women in those days? And how did she kind of get by all of that to succeed the way she did? Because it's very difficult.
Yes, it's very difficult. I think that answer comes in two parts. And one of them, the first is, when we think of suffrage, when we think of that era that she was in, particularly in intellectual circles, we really focus on the East. We're located in our imaginations in New York and DC, maybe Philadelphia, and possibly San Francisco. We don't really think about the West and what was going on there. But the fact of the matter is, in these Western states, which were actually the first to grant women suffrage, the vote, there was a greater sense of gender equality. Simply because if you are going to survive on a homestead in Montana, everyone brings the harvest in, men and women. Everybody raises the barn. And if your wife is giving birth and there's no one around, you, her husband, are going to deliver that baby, right? Everyone's work is seen because everyone's work is vital. And that wasn't true on the East Coast, where you have these very set hierarchies that were expert at erasing women's labor. So, in that regard, having her run as a congressperson in this cultural sensibility was not as far-fetched as it might have been in New York, for instance. It wasn't necessarily seen as purely an anomaly or a novelty. In addition to that, she was incredibly skilled at media. I don't want to say manipulation, but that's what it was. She was a great orator. She knew how to present herself. She knew how to be photographed. She grew up in a wealthy family, although, they still had to work on the ranch. They were also, some of the wealthiest in Missoula, and the newspapers followed their social activities. So she was introduced to the media at a very young age. And so she had a particular skill set in a particular place at a particular time that all came together to enable her to achieve what she did. Now, I would also say that she, like women today, women in politics today, still had to navigate that high wire where she had to be everything to everyone, an enemy to none, a friend to all. She had to be strong, but not overwhelmingly how do you say?
Overbearing.
What's the word? What's that?
Overbearing.
Overbearing, or, she couldn't threaten the men around her, right? She always had to present herself in a way that was in service to them and their goals rather than ensure her goals. Still a problem for women. Yeah, these are all things that women continually confront. We cannot be ourselves in and of ourselves. We have to be for someone else. So eventually, after her first term, this caught up with her and she couldn't continue to navigate to balance that high wire. And in addition, Anaconda Copper went to the state legislature, which they have basically bankrolled all of, and got them to gerrymander her seat. And she was, unable to even run again for a second term in Congress.
Is par for the course. The business interests, I'm sure, made it very, very difficult for her to continue. But she did get reelected.
Yes.
Let's talk about World War I for a second. She voted against it. Woodrow Wilson cannot have been terribly pleased, although he wasn't dying to get into the war himself. But Woodrow Wilson later consulted with her on the 14 points. And a lot of the 14 points are Jeanette Rankin's work. Talk about that a bit.
Well, I do want to just clarify that a little bit. The 14 points were a lot of the material for Woodrow Wilson's 14 points came out of a conference in Zurich in 1919 by the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. So it was Jeanette Rankin was a key member. It was founded by Jane Addams. Mary Church Terrell was there, in addition to a lot of other, American and international women peace activists. So Jeanette was crucial in crafting those documents,
But didn't do it herself.
along with a great, no, she didn't do it herself. But, she was one of America's foremost peace activists, and you can see her handiwork there. So to your point, Wilson's 14 points were very much taken from these documents. 9 out of his 14 points were taken from these documents. Tellingly, he left out their suggestion that all women should be enfranchised globally and that all colonies should be freed from colonial rule. And in addition, Wilson never credited the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom for their contribution to his generative document that continues to influence international relations today. And I would encourage a typical politician. Yes, right. I did this, no one else. And Jane Addams did present those to him. But yeah, I would just encourage anyone. They're easy to find online, to go and look at them. They're fascinating and continue to be, I believe, relevant to today, especially as citizens. As international relations between governments continue to falter and citizens are looking for ways to find ways to have diplomacy between each other, this is a great place to look and a great place to start in thinking about how to influence your government's international relations on a grassroots level.
Let's jump ahead to World War II. She voted against it. Not a popular move. What sort of blowback did she receive from her colleagues, from the public, from Montana for her decision?
Yes, it was extremely brutal and immediate. She was chased out of the chamber. People were just screaming at her. Congress there was very lax security that day. Anyone and everyone who wanted to get in could get in. She had to push through the crowd. She was followed by a drunken service member who was screaming at her. And she took refuge in a phone booth in the cloak room, I believe, and called the Capitol Police for an escort. And you have to remember this was 2 days after the attacks on Pearl Harbor. This was December 9th, the vote was taken. And of course, December 7th were the attacks on Pearl Harbor. And immediately after that, people called for her resignation. They demanded that she rescind her vote. They called her a traitor. And it was a moment of extreme fear in American history. It was the first time we had been attacked by a foreign nation. The attack seemed almost ghost-like. I mean, the feat that the Japanese Imperial Navy and Air Force carried out was extraordinary. And it didn't seem possible that they would be able to do this. And so for someone to vote against that retaliation seemed impossible. if not unpatriotic, to say the least. But she had been warning the world that this continual armament would only lead to war, that bellicose foreign policy would push the Japanese government into an attack like this because they felt economically pressured to do so. Mm-hmm. There, and it wasn't, as in World War I, in World War II, every time that an appropriations bill came to her desk asking for more funding for the troops, she voted yes. She was not about standing in the way of America's success or about impeding, the ability for us to bring our men and women home in one piece and alive. Her point in voting no for war was to make an immutable record that there could have been another way, and that the world did not have to race toward the ruination that was World War II. And I think in the ways, at the beginning, I said her stance really flies in the face of the popular narrative of World War I and II. And oftentimes we're told that these were unavoidable conflicts. But what studying Jeanette Rankin and the people that she worked with has really taught me was that they were not unavoidable, that they could have been avoided, and that we can avoid such conflicts in the future. And while it was a moral imperative to fight fascism, we could have fought it before with democratic reforms rather than later with guns and bombs and tanks.
Yeah. One of the little known facts about World War II and the Japanese invasion was that the Japanese attack was that the Japanese were extremely disadvantaged by the oil embargo that we imposed on them.
Yes.
And in part, what they did was, at least in their minds, retaliation for the oil embargo. And I think they felt that they had no other choice. Now, Yamamoto warned them that this could be a disaster, but they didn't listen, and they went ahead and proceeded. And that gave the United States the excuse to go to war. But if you go back, there probably were a million different decisions that were made by all of the parties that could have averted war, not least of which was Germany's decision to become an aggressor.
Exactly. And I don't think we talk about that enough when we talk about the wars.
No, we don't. Talk about some of her other accomplishments as a member of Congress during her two terms, her two sojourns.
Well, there are many. Her first vote was against World War I. Her first act in Congress was to introduce the bill that would become the Susan B. Anthony Amendment, of course, the 19th Amendment to the Constitution, granting women the right to vote. She also was the co-author and co-sponsor of the Robinson-Rankin bill that was the first bill that proposed to put women's health care in the federal budget, right? This is 1919. That sounds kind of crazy thinking back. However, at the time, the government was spending hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars on animal husbandry, right? But $0 on maternal health or prenatal health or women's health care in general. And as a result, women were dying really in droves, particularly in rural areas like those that Jeanette Rankin represented, because there was no access to health care. So her bill would have provided for that health care, for rural health care, basically locations. And she continued to lobby for that outside of Congress and eventually passed it, I believe, in 1921, I want to say, in the Shepard-Townsend bill, which really set precedents for women's health care in the federal budget from then until now. And again, we are looking at budget cuts to women's health care in rural areas that will result in the death of women who are giving birth. And we find parallels again with Jeanette's story. One of the most, I don't know, I really love this idea as a way of of crossing the aisle. Again, I believe it was in 1918 to 1919. The harvest was really bad in Montana. Something had happened. There was a drought and a lot of crops had failed. And at the time, you only had so much seed. You had to save a lot of your seed. And if you didn't have a crop, you couldn't then save the seeds from that crop. And so they were in a real crisis. And so Jeanette, but at the time, and I believe this is still holds true now, every district in Congress gets an allotment of seeds for their farmers to plant, regardless of whether you live in a city, whether you represent a city or you represent a rural area with a great deal of farmers. So realizing this and realizing Montana farmers were in need of seed, she worked with her urban, fellow congressional members to secure their seed allotments and then give them to Montana's farmers. So through this very ingenious problem-solving process, she was able to save Montana's harvest in 1918 and 1919, which is particularly important given that we were fighting a war and that food security is incredibly important during wartime. And in particular, Montana provided the armed services with a lot of potatoes, which, as you know, perhaps as a military scholar, are incredibly important to any campaign.
Yeah.
So those were a number of her more laudable accomplishments, but there are many, and just being the first woman in Congress, starting to normalize the idea of having a woman in the highest halls of power was an accomplishment in and of itself.
It really was. Talk about her work as a suffragette.
So yeah, her work as a suffragist was really extraordinary. As I said, she really didn't start until she was 28 years old. She was sort of casting about. She had a graduate degree from the New York School of Philanthropy, which is now the Columbia Graduate School of Social Work. But she still, at the time, suffrage, this was 1909, suffrage was not on everyone's radar. And she only discovered that women had advocated for the right to vote while she was in graduate school. But she still didn't know if she wanted to go that route. Well, she went to Washington to work at a orphanage, basically, as a case manager, but that didn't work out. And she went back to school at the University of Washington, where the local suffrage organizers were calling for volunteers, and she saw that in the student newspaper. She answered the call, and they were sort of hazing the newbie, and they gave her a sort of gargantuan pile of posters to wheat paste around the city. Mm-hmm. But being from Montana, used to raising, barns and riding horses and painting barns, she had no problem putting these up all over Seattle. And in addition, she really grew up in her father. Her father was a man of many trades, but one of them was he owned a lumber mill and timber. And they would go out to the lumber camps, and she would cook dinner for the lumberjacks. And so she was very used to talking to men, and in particular, rather bawdy men, as it were. And so she went into barbershops and asked them to hang up the posters. And they would laugh at her, but they would do it. And she would always say, it doesn't matter if they laugh at me, just as long as they're talking about me. Something I think Oscar Wilde would have appreciated. Mm-hmm. But in any case, they were so impressed with her that they really elevated her in the organization. And then Minnie J. Reynolds who was a prominent suffragist on the national stage, gave her a recommendation to the, national organization, which she then became the field secretary of. She not only did grassroots organizing and just constant speeches everywhere, but she lobbied in state houses, and in particular in Albany, where she didn't make many inroads, but did meet then state legislature Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who she did not like very much because he both opposed women's suffrage and ending child labor at the time. Another of her passions in life was to end child labor. And so that's when their sort of political animus began, interestingly. But yeah, and then, as I said, she transitioned to really focusing on Montana. And now I'm really fascinated by her political strategies in Montana. Because if we think about Montana now, today, we envision this broad, rugged state where there's not a lot of roads, there's not a lot of transportation, you probably don't get cell service everywhere. Well, imagine it in 1912 when she's campaigning for women's suffrage. She's taking the train, she's borrowing Fords, she's riding horses, she's riding in ox carts, she's walking, she's getting to these rural outposts by whatever means necessary to talk about women's suffrage. And in addition, she doesn't just talk about women's suffrage there. She recruits in these rural outposts in these small towns. She recruits basically precinct captains to then organize on behalf of suffrage in their own communities. And in this way, she builds a really extensive constellation of activists that are all working towards the same goal, but in their own ways that are appropriate to their communities. And it is such a fantastic model for grassroots organizing, because it's not just about activating the people, it's about empowering people to make the changes they need to see, they want to see, the way that they think they need to be made in their communities. And that's what she did. And so in 11, when the state legislature first voted on it, it was voted, not unanimously, but it lost by an overwhelming majority. 2 years later, she and her network of suffragists had flipped the state house, both state houses, so that it passed with only 2 dissenting votes in both houses. And I just want to say that is the power of grassroots organizing.
It is.
It's, yes.
What you touched on a bit of it, but go into a little more detail about her work after her second go around in Congress.
So after her second term in Congress ended in 1942, she really, to a large degree, retired from public life. Now, one of the other things, Jeanette Rankin is such a fascinating and multifaceted character. And sorry, this is somewhat of a diversion, seemingly. But in 1917, right, she was also called a traitor, not only because of her vote against the war, but also because she supported Irish nationhood. She supported Irish independence. And because she believed that if you want democracy, you want democracy for everyone, not just for colonial powers. So she did the same thing in World War II, where she said, if England is on the side of freedom and democracy, then why is India still their colony? And she was very fascinated and inspired by Mahatma Gandhi's nonviolence movement and wanted to find a way back to peace after, a period of unimaginable war. And so after the war, she began going to India for long periods of time unfortunately, Mahatma Gandhi had been assassinated by then, but she spent a lot of time with those in his movement, studying with them, spending time in his last home, learning about their strategies for organizing and self-reliance. And at one point, and unfortunately this is lost, but at one point she drove across the whole of India from north to south by herself.
Oh my goodness. Just
to talk to the people. I mean, she was an extraordinary woman. But then in, the 1960s, in 1965, when America first sent combat troops to Vietnam, she saw the industrial complex turning over again to another global conflict, and she couldn't stay silent anymore. And she placed an ad in the paper, in her local papers in Montana, simply saying, call your congressperson and make sure they oppose the war. Well, this got picked up by national newspapers, and so suddenly her little ad became a national story, and early peace activists began to search her out. And she really became a national figure for peace again in her later years. She helped organize the first and one of the largest all-women protests against the Vietnam War called the Jeanette Rankin Brigade. They marched to Capitol Hill. And interestingly, they peacefully assembled, as one does when one is a patriot, on the steps of the Capitol, and they were arrested. And those members who were arrested sued and won in the Supreme Court the right to peacefully assemble on the steps of Congress. So we have the Jeanette Rankin Brigade today to thank today for that right. Now, of course, she was welcomed into Congress as an alum of the House, but others were not. So she continued to advocate for peace during the 1960s. And then she went back to her other sort of calling, which was the expansion of democratic rights and the electorate. And specifically, she advocated strongly for ranked choice voting, multiple member congressional districts, and the abolition of abolishing the Electoral College, which fascinatingly she advocated for those things in 1914 to 1917 when she was campaigning for Congress. So these were also lifelong passions of hers, and I think she really. These things competed in her heart for primacy, and she wasn't sure which came first, peace or democracy, but she knew they were intertwined. And so at various points in her life, she devoted herself fully to either or both.
She really was ahead of her time in so many respects.
Absolutely. She was, and it's very, I really hope folks hear her voice echoing in our own moment, because she was ahead of her time, but I got to say, she is certainly of our time.
That leads me to my last question. What are the lessons that women activists can learn from Jeanette Rankin today? I mean, I know it's sort of a broad question, but pick out a few examples of things that she's done, aside from grassroots, which is something that I think a lot of female activists are engaged in tremendously, as are male activists. But what can we learn from her?
Yes, do it anyway. If people tell you not to, if people tell you to sit down, to wait your turn, that you're not qualified, do it anyway. Run, speak up at your city council meeting, write your congressperson, get involved, get activated. You are a citizen of this country, or you might be an immigrant to this country, but you are entitled to participating in the democratic institutions of this country. So do it anyway. Do not let anyone tell you that you should not and cannot be there. The other thing that is really important, I think, for women activists to understand, and that Jeanette Rankin and so many others typify, is that women are at their most powerful when we are in community with each other. Jeanette always had an incredible group of women around her, and without them, she would not have been able to accomplish what she did. Part of that was she was one of five girls. And so her literal sisters provided that sisterhood, but she also had a friend network that were her champions throughout her most difficult and her most, victorious of times. So build a community with the people around you. It might be your church. It could be your sewing group. It could be your family. It might be folks at your gym, whoever it is. Build community, because in them you have all the more power. And the last thing I would say that might be controversial, but I think it's really important that Jeanette really lived, was we have to articulate that women's rights are not only human rights, but men's rights. What is good for us is good for everyone. When we are more free, you are more free. And so often the genders are pitted against one another, as if my freedom, it takes away from a man's freedom, when in fact the opposite is true.
Well, there are people who have an interest in fostering that, aren't there?
Oh, yes, many, many. And that was true in suffrage, right, as well. I mean, the, general narrative was, if you give women the right to vote, then your vote will be worth half as much. Mm-hmm. But the fact of the matter is, when you have more people voting with you, your vote means more, and it's more difficult to manipulate in the ways that it was being manipulated then and is being manipulated now. which then ties back to her lifelong commitment to expanding the electorate and voting rights. So those, I believe, are the particularly important lessons for women to take away from Jeanette's story.
That's a great coda to a great story overall. One last thing. Repeat the name of the book for our listeners so that they can go out and get it. And I recommend that they go out and get it, not from Amazon.
Yeah.
But yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so it's Winning the Earthquake, How Jeanette Rankin Defied All the Odds to Become the First Woman in Congress. And it comes out November 4th, Election Day, 2025. You can get it at your local bookstore, at bookshop.org, at Barnes & Nobles, and other booksellers.
Thank you so much. This has been a delight.
Thank you.
It's been a delight, an educational experience, and I hope everybody else feels the same way.
Thank you so much, Mark. I'm so glad to be here.